It's a beautiful bacon day, Cookie Crusaders. Today we're going to be covering something a little bit different that I haven't done before. That's because this took quite a lot of time to put together, and I hope that you're going to find it useful. So what you see before you is my tier list of treasures equipped to specific cookies. So to go in further detail, I tested out each single cookie that I had at least level 55 or higher, and 3 stars or higher. That way I could get the most accurate results across the board rather than having wildly different results from low-level cookies or low-starred cookies that just didn't meet requirements. So, without further ado, you're not going to see every single cookie on this list, but you are going to see quite a lot. Now, when I tested these cookies, I just used what I figured was their optimal toppings, and then I ran just that cookie and just that treasure. And then I recorded the results. So when I show the list here, anything that's an SS tier was the absolute most overwhelming amount of power that cookie had from that single treasure. Now, this can vary when it comes to different teams, and it also can vary based on what team you are fighting. I did use only one specific team for every single cookie, so the variations should not be there as far as the treasures and the cookies versus the team, but rather just the results that they got. So starting with dark cacao, the feather, which you're going to see pop up quite a lot, was the best for dark cacao. The reason for this was that second skill activation that he was able to get was able to get a great deal of power out in comparison to many other things. The insignia, the remedy, the scroll, the lollipop, the monocle, they all did really well. They gave him more time to get chances to get a skill off again. However, because it wasn't going as strongly as the feather, and it did not have as much damage output, that is why it didn't make it. Because what happens is, not only with the feather do you get immediately revived with full health and no debuffs, but you get the skill instantly too. And that's the biggest thing. With the scroll, with the insignia, with the monocle, you still have the debuffs on there. The monocle and the remedy, yes, they can remove them, but they take a while to get them off, and their timing can be a little off. So that's why those did not make it into the SS tier, and it was dwarfed down by the feather. Some of the other treasures, of course, are usable, but you can see the paper charm was probably the least effective treasure on dark cacao altogether. Hollyberry, remedy was the best. Healing a large percentage of health and giving attack percent increases was supremely powerful for Hollyberry. Now, of course, this is manageably different in most teams because it goes to the person with the highest health, and you also have to think, is that what you've built? Is that how you are trying to build it? Are you trying to have Hollyberry be your attacker? It's hard to say. So this is more just as a single cookie, Remedy does really great work on her, but not so much in a team-orient style unless you're specifically building around that design. So keep that in mind. The other S tiers were the scroll, the feather, and that was it. Everything else pretty much went down on the lower tiers. The lollipop was a close one to an S tier, but it really didn't perform as it should have, and everything else just really was not cutting it, which surprised me because I thought that having more time from the insignia, I thought having more health from the feather, the flamingo, having more time to survive with jellyworm or monocle, I thought that was going to make a difference. It really didn't. They wanted the skill activations, and they wanted the ability to push forward with more damage. So those S and SS tiers were the ones that really shined well. For pure vanilla, the SS tier was the lollipop. This raised attack and critical percentages. So the healing was stronger, and the crits more likely to be hit, therefore dealing more healing damage as well. So obviously normal damage can't happen from pure vanilla, but the healing potential was best increased with the lollipop. The next best thing was the feather, as that was just giving more skill activations, more time, more ability to survive. And so those were the two pretty high outliers. Everything else did okay, but those were the ones that really stood out. Sea Fairy, a couple SS tiers, Scroll and Feather. So Scroll, because there's so many hits coming off of Sea Fairy and so many different targets, it matched just as nicely as the Feather did. And so both of those were viable options. Now combined together, of course, it makes an absolute monster. But nonetheless, in single comparisons, both of those were really good. The Jelly Worm and the Lollipop both worked as well because it just gave more time, more attack power, more critical chances. But nonetheless, they weren't as powerful as the other two, but they did a good job. Frost Queen, Feather, like I said, you're going to see that pop up a lot, was the most powerful. The Scroll and the Remedy and the Lollipop did a really good job too. I was quite surprised to see the Remedy come up on this list for Frost Queen, but because the time that it gives for Frost Queen to cast another skill and get that freeze out, which deals damage to the entire enemy team, that's what really mattered here. And so that was what was important and what did pretty well. Moving down to Dark Chocolate, our SS tier was the Feather, and our S tier was Insignia and the Jelly Worm. So the reason Insignia and Jelly Worm worked really well for here was that Dark Chocolate hits every enemy. So the longer that he is around, the longer chances he has to cast skills against every single unit, therefore dealing more damage. That's why Feather works so well for him, because more chances to hit that lightning strikes upon all the enemies. And then in addition, lowering the defense just helped a lot too. As you can see, Scroll and the Flamingo Tube were close to SS tiers, an S tier, but they did not meet the full capabilities, but they were close. So time and power and skill activation were definitely important for Dark Chocolate. Werewolf Cookie, Feather, of course, more activations, faster chances for attacks. It worked really well. Here's one of the new S tiers, where Attack Robes was really powerful. So adding the Attack Robes and the attack speed, it did increase the animation speed. It almost gave Werewolf double strike. So it was an interesting ploy of how the damage was dealt from Werewolf, and I think that leads me more in a direction to build attack speed on Werewolf in comparison to your traditional setups on some of the other cookies. And so that's something more to explore, but the attack speed was one of the strong, not the strongest, but one of the strong outliers that could almost match the Feather. Raspberry Cookie. This time, the Insignia and the Robes were pretty good. They were not as powerful as the Feather, of course, but they were very close. Very, very close. Same kind of thing, extra skill activations, longer time, faster attacks. They all mattered for Raspberry. As we move down to Mala Cookie, here was one of the first that the Insignia was more important. Now, I believe this is because when Mala strikes her ability, you get constant overtime periodic damage against the enemy team. And a lot of cookies can't handle that. And so therefore, the longer you have, the more chance you have to actually make that work. And as you can see over there on the other side of the NAs, the Jelly Worm was equally matched in power to the Insignia. So that was almost irrefutable proof that time was the biggest deal for Mala. Obviously, you add the Feather, you add the Flamingo Tube, you add the Scroll, you just increase the chances of dealing great damage. And in addition, if you add the Scythe for critical, and if you add the Clock for skill activation, those were great too. So the skill was a huge deal for Mala, and having time for it to inflict the damage was important too. And so those are things to keep in mind with Mala. Moving down to Tea Night, similar situation. Tea Night Insignia was the best, did not have the same results from Jellyworm, so the Insignia was the most important. But the Scroll and the Feather were not far behind. So the skill activation, adding those buffs, and then the time from the Insignia and other healing options, that was important. Now, Remedy did not do great. Monocle did not do great. And that's because they didn't really give him actual time. Tea Night, if it's not built with like massive damage resistance, you're not going to get a lot of time because people are just going to chip right through you. So you have to build in that sense of mind, but also some treasures just can't protect cookies as well as others. Moving on to Madeline, we are back down to the SS tier being under the Feather. And then the S tier here is going to be the Remedy. So the healing and attack was pretty close here on Madeline. And that was because Madeline, even though operates well in a speed team, that is specifically the attacks being more or less doubled, if that makes sense. So when Madeline's in a speed team and you add attack speed to Madeline, it's similar to Double Strike. You're just attacking twice as fast or dealing twice as much damage. Now, if you're healing a cookie and they're getting an attack buff, it's a similar situation. It's not all at once, it's not at the same time, but over time, they're dealing almost as equally as much damage as if they were sped up. The only exception is if you were able to speed them up and also give them the time, then that's of course more powerful. But you can see the Insignia here is an A category, so time mattered too. Skill activations mattered most because Madeline can attack all cookies along the row with the ranged attacks, and so that's what was important. Strawberry Crepe, they have some interesting setups. So Feather was important because of the skill giving damage resistance, but the attack robes and the flamingo tube, the monocle and the jellyworm, and even the horn all did pretty good. So all of this kind of led to an indication that really, truly time and skill were the most important. The scroll didn't do a lot, which was a little bit surprising, but it really was more interesting to see that just time mattered the most. Anything that gave time was important here as far as the results. Anything that did not didn't really meet up to the bat. So they operate best with time and skill activations. And so that's one reason why I think chocolate toppings are pretty much recommended heavily on Strawberry Crepe, because they seem to utilize it well. Moon Rabbit Cookie. Scroll was a pretty high tier here, but Feather being the skill activation gave the best results. Moon Rabbit is very set up in the sense that you want to have a lot of speed and a lot of power, because the moment you do, you get the healing that's done very heavily from Moon Rabbit, but also some really good damage. So that's something that's a little bit tough to set up, but Moon Rabbit definitely can provide some great results because of it. Moving down to Cocoa, there was a lot of SS here. Scroll, Feather, and the Remedy. So here, attack buffing and skill activations were probably the most important things here. You can see also that the Flamingo Tube, the Insignia, and the Clock all gave some S tier results too. So there's quite a lot of high results in the same amounts. Now, whether or not that means that Cocoa can come back into the meta is still debatable, because we're seeing a lot of meta shifting, of course. But I think that in the future, Cocoa definitely might have a really strong place in certain teams, and how the diversity spreads out and what she can offer to the teams. Now here we get down to the first cookie that can actually take use of the pincushion. And of course they still did damage with the pincushion for all the other cookies, they just really weren't applicable to the actual results of their damage. So that's why I put NA. Snow Sugar can use the actual pincushion, and it was an S tier, same as Scroll, where the Feather was the SS tier. And the reason is more Snow King, more attack speed reduction, more power exertion overall. So the skills were the most important, but the attack buffs were not far behind. And that's because both the pincushion and the Scroll raise Snow King's power, because that's what it specifically is doing, is drawing power from Snow Sugar. And so that's why that worked really well. If we move down to Latte, both the Feather and the Insignia and the Jelly Worm all had great results. Time and skill activation were the most important here. And with Latte, the glyphs and the silence that is ignited, there's a lot of raw power there, but Latte is very squishy. So I think in the future, when I occur enough toppings, I think I'm going to build almond toppings on Latte, similar how to Wild Berry is being built, or Clotted Cream, because powerful overall magic abilities, but easily able to be stricken down. And so I think defense is a huge thing to focus on for Latte to really truly shine. Squid Ink, also an SS tier in the Feather, but the Scroll and also the Scythe, actually. Yes, the Scythe. The Scroll and the Scythe were pretty powerful. They did some great results. They had some amazing damage. The Feather was the most important because jumping back behind lines where you can't be targeted, hitting down 7 tentacle strikes against the enemies, that was the most important thing there. Pumpkin Pie is one of our first to line up with the Scroll and the Pincushion being the SS tier. The reason for this was that the Feather, as soon as you get the Feather pop off for Pumpkin, you give up the other Pumpkin, and in most cases, Pom Pom will survive for quite a long time. And so for that reason, you're actually giving up power when you resummon based on a Feather. So that was not producing as much damage as the Scroll and the Pincushion, because both were raising the attack, and one Pom Pom was coming out and just massacring the field as best they could. And it was great. Tiger Lily does, yet again, a Feather for amazing skill activations. So that skills on these cookies are probably one of the most important things. It's hard to find cookies that don't benefit hugely from skills. You'll see a couple coming up that can benefit from something else instead. So there are some few exceptions, but in most cases, you're going to want the skills off these cookies for sure. The S tier did go under Insignia and Flamingo Tube, and the Jelly Worm and the Clock for Tiger Lily, because of activating the skills and just having more time. The transformations give you a whole bunch of capability and flexibility, and so these were some of the nicest features and things off Tiger Lily. Pastry, similar situation. Feather for activation, of course, but Insignia did really well. And so this is a similar situation to Latte Cookie, where I think that because Pastry is so squishy and so easy to be taken down, that if it's built in a damage resistance type style build instead, that there will be enough time for the attack speed buffs to get onto Pastry, so that the speed is just so unbearable that the damage rains hellfire upon the enemy teams. Something more to experiment with over time, of course. Caramel Arrow was one of the first that didn't care about the Feather. And the reason was the attack speed and the Scroll exerted so much damage from Caramel Arrow that it dwarfed the Feather altogether. Even the Remedy did better keeping Caramel Arrow alive and raising the attack power instead of the Feather reactivating for the skills. And so that was an interesting result to get, but Caramel Arrow was one of the first to not really care about the Feather, the same that some of the other cookies were. Chili Pepper did care about the feather. Having the ability to jump behind enemy team lines, untargetable for a short amount of time, and dealing that damage was very good. The insignia was still a good contender here because, yet again, time was given to Chili Pepper, which gave time for another skill activation. But the other treasure that was good too was the Jelly Worm as well. Same for the time and the ability to not be targeted by debuffs. Both were very helpful. Vampire Cookie actually benefited best from the Flamingo Tube. And this was because the healing vampirism skill that Vampire does has such a huge percentage that when you draw back in to the health you have, that was what was the most powerful. Now the skills and the time coming from Vampire were still strong in the feather and the insignia, but the best results came from the Flamingo Tube, no matter how many times I ran it. So that was a very interesting, unique situation, and one more that needs exploring. Black Raisin got the best results from Jelly Worm. Now, I believe this is because Black Raisin, when the skill goes off, goes into the void and avoids the attacks that come from the other cookies. And so that gives that time there. And the damage is all based in this attack power and critical chances, which can be varying in this multiple attacks that Black Raisin does. But the Jelly Worm gave the ability to avoid all debuffs and just go in as much damage as Black Raisin could without too much concern. Sorbet Cookie best benefited from the feather and the insignia. Did really good with the Flamingo Tube. I think that was mostly just time that was coming from there, but the insignia gave better time results for survivability. And of course the feather just for the skill activation, because the mass amount of damage that Sorbet can pull off is just, it's really impressive, of course. Mushroom Cookie, the best ones here were the Scythe and the Scroll, and then of course the activation of the skill was the best with the feather here as well. And so the reason was here that poison damage can now do critical damage. That is a change that they made. And the feather gave the chance for the skills to happen again, which that poison does amazing jobs since it's persistent over time damage. But the criticals and the attack buffs were not too far behind. With Affogato, it was a little bit different. The feather was still the most powerful. Nothing really hit the S tier though. And so everything else that gave time or gave chances for survivability, that gave Affogato a little bit more of an advantage for that. But nothing hit nearly as strong as just having more skill activations. Mint Cookie is a very skill-happy cookie because attack speed buffing just happens more and more. As you can see, the robe class on the second box, that was an A tier, and that's because attack speed really works well with Mint, since that's the whole focus of Mint. It's not as powerful in damage as the Insignia or as the Jelly Worm, because uninterruptible, inability to be debuff time, those were actually really the most important, but the overall power was still exerting pretty well on the robes in comparison to some of the other treasures too. Pomegranate focuses mostly on healing, but as far as a damage perspective, skill activations once again from the feather, Insignia for time, and Jelly Worm for overall survivability too. Nothing terribly special, nothing much changed in accordance with some of the other supports and healers, but this was the results. Almond Cookie benefited from the feather, but also the Insignia. Everything else didn't really hit up to the A tiers, except the Jelly Worm, and nothing else could really come up to the S tier overall. So mostly skill and time was super important for Almond here, for the most damage to be exerted. Cream Puff Cookie, best from feather, skill activations, but did really good with the slingshot. Now I believe the reason for this is that lowering the defense of the enemy and then hitting a critical hit with the 1100% once you hit that critical, I think in combination with that just did a very big amount of damage that the team was unsuspecting, and you can only have so much damage resistance and critical resistance, and if they have no critical resistance, then they're only getting a certain amount of damage dodge in that case. But these were the best results for Cream Puff. Lilac was, yet again, skill cookie, best benefited by the feather. Nothing really could pull up to S tier here. The Insignia and the Jelly Worm were able to hit the A tiers, and they did good, but the activations of skill was the most important for Lilac here. Parfait, another cookie greatly benefited by the feather. I know it's a trend here at this point, but it's the truth. The Insignia was close behind just because of the overall healing and the debuff resistance and the defense given from that. And the Scroll, the Flamingo Tube, and the Monocle and the Jelly Worm were not terribly far behind. Cotton Cookie, best got skill activation from Feather, but had a very close by with the Scroll. So the Sheep and the overall buffs from the attack percent buffs from Cotton, they came out pretty well from the Scroll. So that was a very close contender. Eclair Cookie, skill activation of course, but interestingly enough, the Scythe and the Scroll and the Robes all worked pretty well. Scythe did the best with the critical, but the Robes and the attack Scroll were not far behind. So something I want to work with more in the future is attack speed on Eclair, and that's because I think the skill animation is so slow that normally you don't get much benefit from their traditional setup, but if you have the attack speed, that animation goes faster, and I think that's why more power was coming from Eclair in this scenario. Second to last cookie is Herb. Best thing was Insignia here. Time was the best thing for Herb, just giving more time. You had S tier from the Feather for reanimation, of course, because a lot of healing exerts when you get reanimated. But overall, time was the best factor, without any doubt. So Herb benefited from that the best, and I think almond setups are probably going to be one of the main setups you could probably do in the future for Herb Cookie. And then last but not least, the last cookie that I can cover today is the new Wild Berry Cookie. Remedy Treasure was a monster for Wild Berry, and that is because healing Wild Berry, having that ability to just continuously stun, continuously get attack buff, and take all that damage and re-healing from the Remedy, because it's such a fast activation, made it to where we almost had 3 full skill activations. Wild Berry almost soloed an entire team on their own, which is normally something that would be in a legendary or ancient status. Now, as you can see, the Scroll didn't do great. The Feather, it did alright. The Insignia and the Flamingo Tube, okay, because more time. But the best was from the Remedy, and that was the attack buff and the healing combined together. And the Monocle was not far behind either. So, if you really truly want to make the most of Wild Berry, healing and attack power pressure is going to be some of the best things that you can do. Now, I'd love to hear in the comments any of your feedback. I will be getting to more of the cookies as I level them up, so this list will grow a little bit bigger in time, and of course as we add new cookies as well. This is the best I can do with single treasures, as there's millions of combinations if I was to do even 2 or 3 treasures at a time just for a single cookie, so it is hard to measure much beyond this. But this does give a good illusion as to what things can be focused on each cookie, and what can be helpful to look at too in the future. Thank you so much for stopping by, and thank you for sitting through this long video, and I look forward to some of the new coming updates that we'll have in the near future.